Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The following content explores the sociological, historical, and legal frameworks surrounding marriage and divorce trends in the American South. This video is intended strictly for educational, historical, and entertainment purposes. It does not constitute legal counsel, family therapy, or professional financial advice. Marital laws vary significantly by state jurisdiction, and individuals facing family law matters should consult a licensed attorney or a qualified professional in their specific area before making any legal or financial decisions. Please conduct your own due diligence. There is a profound statistical paradox tearing through the heart of the American Bible Belt, one that defies everything we think we know about faith, tradition, and regional culture. If you look at the geographic data compiled by the United States Census Bureau, a striking anomaly emerges. The states that historically report the highest rates of religious attendance, the strongest emphasis on traditional family values, and the most conservative social structures also consistently maintain some of the highest divorce rates in the entire nation. For decades, popular culture has perpetuated the narrative that the secular coastal enclaves of the Northeast are the epicenters of marital instability. Yet, the data tells a completely different story. Regions spanning from Arkansas and Oklahoma to Alabama and Kentucky frequently outpace states like Massachusetts and New York in their rates of marital dissolution. This is not just a minor statistical quirk. It is a systemic cultural phenomenon. It forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. Why are the very institutions designed to preserve the sanctity of marriage in the American South seemingly accelerating its breakdown? Over the course of this investigation, we are going to peel back the layers of history, economics, and religion to uncover the hidden mechanisms driving this regional crisis, including a look at how early marriage windows, economic pressures, and unique legal structures create a perfect storm for Southern couples. To truly understand the modern reality of American relationships, we must confront the hidden forces shaping our domestic lives. For decades, millions of people have followed a traditional blueprint for happiness, only to find themselves navigating the emotional and financial fallout of a system they did not fully comprehend. This deep dive masterclass solves that exact problem. By breaking down the complex intersection of regional culture, historical trends, and socio-economic realities, we are providing you with the analytical tools to understand why relationships succeed or fail in the modern landscape. We are moving past the superficial advice found in standard self-help media to examine the structural realities of family life. Through documented case studies and historical data, you will discover how regional environments silently influence your personal choices, your financial stability, and your expectations of partnership. This is a comprehensive examination of the cultural forces that dictate the trajectory of American families, offering the clarity needed to navigate a rapidly changing social world. To comprehend why the American South experiences these distinct marital patterns, we have to look closely at the phenomenon of early marriage. In many Southern communities, the cultural timeline for adulthood is significantly accelerated compared to other regions of the country. Sociological studies tracking demographic milestones show that the median age for a first marriage in states like Texas, Mississippi, and Arkansas is noticeably lower than the national average. While a young adult in New York or California might delay marriage until their late 20s or early 30s to focus on higher education and career stabilization, many Southern young adults enter marriage in their early 20s. This accelerated timeline is heavily influenced by deep-seated cultural expectations. In many traditional communities, marriage is viewed as the primary gateway to true adulthood, financial independence, and social acceptance. There is an immense, often unspoken social pressure to find a partner during the college years or immediately after high school. This expectation is frequently reinforced by local community structures, peer groups, and family networks that celebrate early domesticity. However, entering a lifelong legal and financial contract at a young age carries inherent structural risks. From a developmental perspective, the human brain continues to undergo significant changes in executive functioning, risk assessment, and long-term planning well into a person's mid-20s. When individuals marry in their early 20s, they are making profound, long-term commitments before their career trajectories, financial habits, and personal identities are fully formed. As the years progress, the natural evolution of personality can create a widening gap between partners. The career goals that seem certain at age 21 may shift radically by age 27. Financial habits that were manageable in a young, low-stakes environment can become major points of contention when mortgages, childcare, and long-term debt enter the equation. Case studies from family counselors in the region frequently highlight a common pattern. Couples who married young often report that they simply grew into completely different people with incompatible life goals. The initial alignment that brought them together in youth did not survive the transition into mature adulthood. Beyond the developmental factors, early marriage intersects directly with economic vulnerability. When a couple marries young, they generally possess fewer financial assets, lower educational attainment, and less career stability than those who delay marriage. This brings us to the second major structural pillar driving regional divorce rates: the unique economic landscape of the American South. While the South boasts thriving metropolitan hubs, large swaths of the region are characterized by rural economies, lower median household incomes, and less diversified job markets compared to the Northeast or the West Coast. According to data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, several southern states consistently rank in the lower quartile for per capita personal income. The correlation between financial stress and marital instability is well documented by sociologists and economists alike. Financial strain acts as a massive amplifier for existing marital friction. When a household is living paycheck to paycheck, every minor economic disruption, a sudden car repair, a medical bill, or a temporary reduction in work hours, escalates into a major domestic crisis. The daily anxiety of managing scarce resources erodes emotional resilience, leaving couples with less patience and capacity to navigate standard relationship challenges. Furthermore, the types of employment prevalent in certain southern industries add physical and emotional strain to marriages. Industries such as agriculture, manufacturing, logistics, and oil and gas extraction often require long hours, rotating shifts, or extended periods away from home. For instance, in the energy sectors of Texas and Louisiana, workers frequently pull grueling shifts or travel to remote sites for weeks at a time. This physical separation, combined with the sheer exhaustion of manual labor, can create an emotional disconnect between spouses. The partner at home often bears the full burden of domestic management and childcare, leading to feelings of isolation and resentment, while the working partner feels disconnected from the daily life of the family. When you combine the structural realities of early marriage with persistent economic pressures and demanding career paths, the foundation of the household faces continuous stress. These pragmatic factors create a baseline of vulnerability that defies simple cultural explanations. In the upcoming sections of this masterclass, we will expand this investigation even further, looking at how religious frameworks, legal evolutions, and shifting community dynamics interact with these economic realities to shape the modern Southern family structure. To fully comprehend how these historical trends and regional patterns manifest in everyday life, let us examine a specific case study that reflects the modern reality of many couples in the year 2026. Consider the journey of a couple we will call Brandon and Ashley, living just outside of Birmingham, Alabama. Married at age 21 straight out of their local community network, their early relationship was deeply embedded in the social fabric of their town. In the beginning, their paths seemed entirely aligned with regional expectations. Early domesticity, a rapid transition into homeownership, and a shared commitment to local community values. However, as the economic landscape of 2026 continues to shift, the structural vulnerabilities of their early commitment begin to surface. Brandon works in specialized industrial logistics, a demanding sector subject to the fluctuating supply chains of the modern economy. Ashley manages a local healthcare administrative office, while balancing the primary responsibilities of raising two young children. Imagine if you are constantly balancing a household budget where fixed costs like health insurance, grocery inflation, and regional property taxes eat up exactly 92% of your take-home pay. For Brandon and Ashley, this is not a hypothetical exercise. It is their daily existence. The fast pacing of modern economic life leaves very little room for error. When Brandon is required to work 60-hour weeks to maintain their baseline income, he is physically absent from the home. When Ashley faces the compounding pressure of managing a household solo during those long hours, the emotional distance between them begins to widen. This case study demonstrates that the breakdown of a marriage rarely begins with a singular, explosive conflict. Instead, historical trends suggest it is a slow, structural erosion accelerated by modern socio-economic pressures. This brings us directly to the profound role that religious frameworks play in shaping both the initiation and the dissolution of marriages in the American South. The region is historically referred to as the Bible Belt due to its high density of evangelical Christian denominations. In these communities, religious institutions are not merely places of weekend worship, They serve as the foundational civic, social, and cultural infrastructure. For a young couple like Brandon and Ashley, their entire social capital is often tied directly to their church congregation. This environment creates a highly unique set of behavioral expectations and psychological pressures that do not exist to the same degree in more secular regions of the country. Within many traditional Southern congregations, there is a powerful cultural emphasis placed on the sanctity of marriage and the explicit rejection of secular relationship models. Cohabitation before marriage is frequently discouraged, creating a distinct systemic incentive for young couples to marry quickly. In many cases, couples who wish to experience adult intimacy, share living expenses, or simply achieve social validation within their community feel compelled to enter a legal marriage far earlier than their peers in other parts of the United States. This accelerated path directly contributes to the early marriage window we analyzed previously, trapping couples in a complex paradox where the institutional pressure to remain pure or traditional inadvertently pushes them into a high-risk marital category. Once the marriage is established, the religious framework introduces a second layer of complexity, the concept of marital endurance at all costs. When marital friction inevitably arises due to financial strain or personality divergence, the advice sought by couples in this region often undergoes a highly specific filtering process. Rather than consulting secular family therapists or licensed financial counselors, many Southern couples turn exclusively to pastoral counseling. While pastoral counseling offers spiritual support, it historically emphasizes reconciliation, prayer, and individual endurance over pragmatic behavioral intervention or structural separation. For an individual facing deep marital unhappiness, this creates an intense psychological conflict. The community message is clear. A failed marriage is viewed not just as a legal dissolution, but as a profound spiritual and personal failure. This creates a powerful containment mechanism that can keep troubled marriages together for years. However, when the pressure within the household becomes unsustainable, the eventual breakdown is often catastrophic. When a divorce does occur in this environment, the social fallout is total. The individuals do not just lose a spouse, they frequently lose their entire community support network, their peer groups, and their standing within the church, leading to an incredibly isolating and high-stakes legal journey. To understand the mechanics of this isolation, we must look at how the legal evolution of divorce laws in the United States operates differently across state lines, particularly in the South. Historically, getting a divorce in America required proving fault. One spouse had to legally demonstrate that the other had committed a specific transgression, such as adultery, cruelty, or desertion. This changed dramatically in the late 20th century with the widespread adoption of no-fault divorce laws, which allowed couples to dissolve a marriage based simply on irreconcilable differences. However, the legal framework of the American South retained distinct regional characteristics that continue to influence potential outcomes for couples in 2026. For example, states like Mississippi were among the absolute last in the nation to fully modernize their no-fault divorce statutes. For decades, if one spouse in Mississippi wanted a no-fault divorce, both spouses had to mutually agree to it. If one partner refused to sign the paperwork, the seeking spouse was forced to prove explicit fault in a court of law, a process that requires extensive documentation, private investigators, and exorbitant legal fees. Imagine the immense leverage this legal structure grants to a resistant partner. In a highly contentious separation, the legal system itself can be weaponized to prolong emotional distress and financial depletion. Even in Southern states that have fully adopted no-fault principles, the statutory waiting periods and mandatory separation timelines can be significantly longer than those found in the Northeast. For instance, some jurisdictions require a continuous one-year physical separation before a divorce can be legally finalized, during which time the couple must maintain separate households while navigating the ongoing financial obligations of their joint assets. This legal friction creates a highly volatile environment for families navigating a breakup. During a mandatory one-year separation, the financial vulnerabilities we discussed earlier are magnified exponentially. A household that was already struggling to survive on a dual income must suddenly find the resources to fund two separate rents, two sets of utility bills, and potentially competing legal retainers, all while trying to maintain stability for their children. The historical trends show that these prolonged legal battles do not deter divorce. Rather, they ensure that when a divorce does happen, it causes maximum economic devastation to both parties. The intersection of these three forces, the accelerated timeline driven by social expectations, the intense containment and subsequent isolation enforced by religious frameworks, and the rigid friction built into regional legal codes, creates a distinct cultural journey that is unique to the American South. It is a journey marked by high stakes, intense community scrutiny, and profound systemic pressures that can transform a private domestic challenge into a public, multi-layered crisis. As Brandon and Ashley navigate the realities of their community expectations and the rigid legal landscape of their home state, they represent thousands of modern couples caught in this exact regional matrix. The decisions they make are never truly made in isolation. They are guided, restricted, and amplified by the hidden cultural architecture surrounding them. But what happens when the traditional support systems completely fail and the legal battle lines are officially drawn? How do Southern couples navigate the complex realities of asset division, child custody, and community reentry when the very fabric of their social world is designed to penalize their choice? In the next part of this masterclass, we will dive deep into the hidden mechanics of the Southern courtroom, examining how regional custody biases and the unique valuation of marital property shape the ultimate financial and personal outcomes for modern families. To accurately map the trajectory of this journey, we must step directly inside the marble corridors of the Southern family court system. This is where the cultural ideology of the region collides head-on with cold, statutory reality. For many couples embarking on this process in the year 2026, the courtroom experience reveals a stark disconnect between traditional community ideals and the objective, often rigid mechanics of state law. To understand this dynamic, let us analyze a case study involving a couple we will call continuous characters, David and Sarah, navigating the family court system in rural Georgia. Sarah has spent the last 9 years as a stay-at-home mother, deeply embedded in her local community, managing the household and raising their 3 children. David has spent that same decade climbing the ranks of a regional agricultural logistics firm, operating as the primary financial provider. In the eyes of their social circle, they fulfilled the quintessential traditional regional blueprint. But as they enter the litigation phase, the structural division of labor that once defined their marriage now becomes the central battleground for their asset division and long-term security. Imagine, if you are Sarah, stepping into a courtroom realizing that your 10 years of domestic labor, childcare, and career sacrifices do not possess a straightforward liquid valuation when it comes to dividing a modern marital estate. In the American South, states generally operate under the legal principle of equitable distribution rather than community property. While community property states enforce a strict 50-50 split of all assets acquired during the marriage, equitable distribution states require judges to divide property based on what the court deems fair. Fair, however, is a highly subjective metric that depends heavily on a judge's individual interpretation of statutory factors. This creates a high-stakes scenario for both parties. In David and Sarah's case, the primary assets consist of a heavily mortgaged suburban home, David's corporate retirement account, and the equity in a small secondary livestock transport business David launched 3 years ago. Step by step, the legal mechanics of equitable distribution force a forensic examination of these assets. The court does not merely look at who holds the title. It analyzes the economic circumstances of each spouse at the time of the divorce, the contribution of each spouse to the acquisition of the property, and the future earning capacity of both individuals. For Sarah, historical trends in Southern jurisdictions present a distinct hurdle. While courts acknowledge the value of a homemaker, calculating the exact offset for a decade of lost career progression is incredibly complex. A forensic accountant must be brought in to estimate Sarah's realistic earning capacity in the 2026 job market, where her lack of recent corporate experience significantly depresses her starting salary potential. Meanwhile, David faces the daunting prospect of a judge ordering him to liquidate a portion of his retirement accounts or pay a lump sum cash out to Sarah to balance the loss of the marital home, a move that could severely destabilize the operational cash flow of his logistics business. This is where the fast pace of legal fees begins to rapidly drain the very assets the couple is fighting over, demonstrating how the equitable distribution framework can introduce extreme volatility into potential outcomes. The financial friction intensifies when the court pivots to the issue of alimony, or spousal support. Historically, the American South maintained a cultural and legal tradition of long-term spousal maintenance, particularly for wives who stayed at home to raise families. However, historical trends over the past 2 decades show a massive legislative shift across Southern capitals. Modern statutes in states like Florida, Georgia, and Tennessee have aggressively scaled back permanent alimony, replacing it with rehabilitative or transitional support. This means that in 2026, A spouse like Sarah cannot rely on long-term financial support from a former partner. Instead, the legal framework is explicitly designed to push the dependent spouse back into the workforce as rapidly as possible. Rehabilitative alimony is strictly capped, often lasting only 2 to 4 years, with the explicit requirement that the receiving spouse provide a detailed, step-by-step plan demonstrating how they will acquire the education or training necessary to achieve self-sufficiency. For a mother who has been out of the workforce for a decade, this creates an immense high-pressure timeline. She must simultaneously navigate the emotional trauma of a family breakdown, adapt to the rapid technological advancements of the 2026 workforce, and secure a living wage before her temporary support completely evaporates. As the financial battle lines stabilize, the courtroom turns its attention to the most emotionally charged aspect of the entire process: child custody. This is where regional cultural biases can silently influence legal outcomes in unexpected ways. For generations, the tender years doctrine, a judicial presumption that mothers are naturally better suited to care for young children, heavily influenced custody decisions across the United States. While this doctrine has been formally abolished on paper in favor of the best interests of the child standard, the underlying cultural expectation remains deeply entrenched in many rural and suburban Southern judiciaries. Imagine if you are David, a father who has been highly involved in your children's lives despite working 60 hours a week, facing a judicial culture that still frequently views the mother as the default primary caregiver and the father as the default economic provider. In highly contested cases, fathers in the South often report having to meet a significantly higher burden of proof to secure a true 50-50 physical custody arrangement. They must meticulously document their daily involvement, prove their flexible work schedule in 2026, and demonstrate an exceptional capacity to manage the domestic routine without disrupting the children's established school and church schedules. Conversely, this same cultural expectation can place an unfair burden on Sarah. If she attempts to relocate to a different state where her extended family lives to secure a stronger emotional and financial support network, she faces immense legal hurdles. Southern courts are historically highly restrictive regarding parental relocation. The legal system operates on the assumption that maintaining the child's deep roots within the local community, school system, and paternal extended family outweighs the mother's desire for geographic reinvention. A relocation request often triggers an immediate custody evaluation, where a guardian ad litem is appointed to investigate the family, interviewing teachers, neighbors, and pastors to determine if the move is truly in the child's best interest or if it constitutes an attempt to alienate the father. The intersection of these legal mechanics, the unpredictable calculations of equitable distribution, the strict timelines of modern rehabilitative alimony, and the rigid community stabilization metrics of child custody, transforms the Southern courtroom into a crucible. It is an environment where traditional roles are dismantled and reassembled into cold, legally binding decrees that dictate the next 20 years of a family's life. David and Sarah's courtroom battle exposes the harsh reality that when the traditional Southern marriage blueprint breaks down, the legal system does not offer a gentle landing. It demands a precise, often painful realignment of finances and parental roles that can leave both parties structurally vulnerable. But the courtroom decree is not the end of the journey. It is merely the official transition point. What happens when the legal papers are signed, the assets are split, and these individuals must step back out into a tight-knit community that watched the entire collapse unfold? How do divorced individuals navigate the intense social stigma, the fracturing of generational family trees, and the complex process of rebuilding an identity in a culture that values marital status above almost all else? In the next part of this masterclass, we will step out of the courtroom and into the social aftermath, exploring the hidden mechanics of community exile, the restructuring of Southern family networks, and the modern reality of dating and blending families in the heart of the Bible Belt. When the final gavel falls and the courtroom doors close, a completely different type of trial begins for the newly divorced individual in the American South. This is the trial of public opinion, community integration, and social survival. In a region where personal identity is inextricably bound to marital status and family lineage, stepping out of a marriage means stepping into a vacuum of profound social ambiguity. To map this transition, let us continue analyzing the case studies of our individuals, David and Sarah, as they navigate their respective communities in the year 2026. Up until the split, their social lives were entirely synchronized with a local network centered around their suburban church, their children's youth sports leagues, and multi-generational family gatherings. The moment the legal dissolution becomes official, the fast-paced shifting of community alliances begins, exposing the deeply entrenched cultural mechanics of social exile. Imagine if you are Sarah, attending the first Sunday morning church service after the divorce papers have been finalized. For nearly a decade, you sat in the exact same pew, surrounded by families you considered your bedrock support system. Today, however, you notice a subtle but undeniable shift in the social topography. People who previously greeted you with open warmth now offer hesitant, polite nods from a distance. The conversation in the church foyer becomes stilted, halting abruptly when you approach. This is not necessarily born out of overt hostility. Historical trends suggest it is driven by a deep structural discomfort. In traditional communities, a divorced person represents a disruption to the established social order. You are no longer part of a couple, which means you no longer fit cleanly into the couples-based ministries, the dinner parties, or the family-centric volunteer groups that form the backbone of civic life in the region. Step by step, this social friction translates into a form of passive exclusion. Sarah finds herself gradually left off the guest lists for neighborhood gatherings. Her long-term friends, matching historical trends seen in sociological case studies across the Bible Belt, often feel forced to choose sides, or worse, they withdraw entirely to avoid the awkwardness of navigating a fractured dynamic. This isolation is further compounded by a unique psychological undercurrent: the silent fear of marital contagion. In tightly knit communities, the sudden collapse of a seemingly stable, traditional marriage can send shockwaves through other households. By distancing themselves from the divorced individual, neighbors subconsciously protect their own domestic narratives, treating separation as an isolated anomaly, rather than a structural vulnerability that could happen to anyone. While Sarah navigates this subtle social displacement, David faces a completely different set of cultural expectations and pressures as a newly single man in the 2026 Southern landscape. In many traditional networks, a man's value is heavily tied to his role as a provider, structural head of a household. When that household fractures, a father who does not secure primary physical custody can easily find himself cast in the cultural archetype of the transient or displaced parent. Imagine if you are David, trying to maintain a deep, meaningful connection with your 3 children, while living in a corporate apartment complex 10 miles away from their established neighborhood. The regional architecture is fundamentally built for nuclear families. Simple activities like taking your children to a local high school football game or a regional diner on a Friday night suddenly feel performative. You are hyper-aware of the eyes of former neighbors and church members who are silently evaluating your parenting capacity based on brief, public interactions. The potential outcomes for men in this scenario often include a profound sense of rootlessness, as the physical separation from the family home strips away the daily rituals that previously anchored their masculine and regional identity. This isolation triggers a complex restructuring of generational family networks. In the American South, extended family ties, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins, exert an immense amount of influence over daily life. When a divorce occurs, the blast radius impacts these multi-generational structures with devastating force. Maternal and paternal grandparents who once cooperated seamlessly to manage childcare, holiday traditions, and family reunions are suddenly forced into rigid, legally mandated schedules. Consider the logistical and emotional friction this introduces during a traditional Southern holiday season in 2026. Historically, family gatherings are high-stakes, culturally significant events requiring extensive travel, culinary preparation, and community display. Under a modern joint custody decree, Thanksgiving and Christmas are divided with mathematical precision. One year, the children are with the maternal family in rural Mississippi. The next, they are with the paternal family in suburban Alabama. This strict scheduling completely disrupts the organic flow of extended family life. Grandparents find themselves grieving the loss of spontaneous access to their grandchildren, while the children themselves must learn to navigate 2 distinct, often competing family narratives. In many case studies, extended families inadvertently perpetuate the conflict of the initial split by projecting their own feelings of betrayal onto the situation. The paternal family may view Sarah's pursuit of rehabilitative alimony as an attack on David's financial legacy, while the maternal family views David's long work hours as a betrayal of his domestic vows. The children become cultural ambassadors, moving between 2 worlds that are hyper-vigilant for any sign of disrespect or shifting loyalty. As the dust settles on these fractured social and familial networks, the imperative to rebuild pushes these individuals toward the modern landscape of Southern dating and the creation of blended families. This process introduces a fresh matrix of cultural contradictions. In 2026, digital dating platforms have permeated even the most traditional regions. Yet the criteria for matching in the South remain deeply tethered to regional values. A divorced individual entering the dating pool is not merely looking for personal compatibility. They are scanning for indicators of community alignment, spiritual shared values, and step-parenting potential. For Sarah, re-entering this space requires navigating a delicate double standard. Modern case studies show that a divorced mother who dates actively can face intense scrutiny from her existing community, where her actions are viewed through the lens of maternal propriety. If she introduces a new partner to her children too quickly, she risks social censure. If she delays, she faces the profound exhaustion of managing her solo domestic routine without any companionship. When a new relationship does solidify for either David or Sarah, the transition into a blended family structure reveals the final, most complex phase of the cultural divorce journey. Blending families in the heart of the Bible Belt means attempting to build a new traditional household out of the remnants of two separate structural collapses. The challenges are monumental. Step-parents must navigate the deeply entrenched loyalties of children, who still hold onto the narrative of their original family unit. Competing parenting styles, differing religious traditions, and the ongoing presence of former spouses through co-parenting apps and court-ordered drop-offs create a high-velocity environment for potential conflict. Yet, the cultural drive to achieve the appearance of a stable, complete nuclear family remains so powerful that many individuals rush into these blended structures far quicker than structural data would advise. There is a profound desire to regain the social capital, the community validation, and the internal peace that comes with fulfilling the regional blueprint. They seek to replace the narrative of failure with a narrative of redemption and restoration. But what happens when these newly constructed blended families confront the exact same socioeconomic pressures, legal frameworks, and community expectations that dismantled the first marriage? How do the modern couples of 2026 insulate their second partnerships from the systemic regional forces that continue to drive high divorce rates across the American South? In the next part of this masterclass, we will shift our focus to the systemic economic macro trends, exploring how regional wage stagnation, shifting industrial employment, and the rising cost of domestic management are redefining the stability of the modern Southern household from the ground up. To comprehensively analyze how macroscopic economic forces directly destabilize the foundational architecture of the modern Southern home, we must transition from the individual social sphere into the broader marketplace of the year 2026. The American South is currently experiencing a profound structural transformation. For generation after generation, the region attracted manufacturing plants, industrial facilities, and corporate branches by leveraging a highly specific economic blueprint: a lower cost of living, affordable real estate, and a non-unionized, cost-effective labor market. However, historical trends over the last several years have fundamentally disrupted this equilibrium, creating a severe structural squeeze on working-class and middle-class households. To witness the exact mechanics of this disruption, let us analyze a case study involving a couple we will call continuous characters, James and Kimberly, residing in a rapidly industrializing county in eastern Tennessee. James works as a skilled technician at a regional automotive components manufacturing facility, a sector that historically provided a rock-solid, single-income foundation for a family. Kimberly works part-time as a dynamic coordinator for a regional logistical shipping hub, while managing the complex scheduling of their two school-aged children. On paper, their combined household income sits exactly at the regional median. Yet, when we dissect their financial ledger against the backdrop of the 2026 macroeconomy, the mathematical impossibility of their long-term domestic stability becomes glaringly obvious. Imagine if you are James, walking into your workplace realizing that while your facility has reported record-breaking productivity gains, your hourly wage has grown by a mere 2.4% annually over the past 48 months. Meanwhile, the cost of standard domestic management within your specific geographic zip code has escalated at more than double that pace. This is the definition of regional wage stagnation. In the South, this problem is severely amplified by a lack of localized collective bargaining infrastructure, leaving workers with very little leverage to demand wages that keep pace with nationwide inflation. The potential outcomes of this imbalance are not merely financial. They are deeply psychological. When a provider realizes that working harder and executing longer hours yields a diminishing standard of living, the internal stress is immense. That stress does not stay confined to the factory floor or the logistics office. It travels directly back to the kitchen table. Step by step, the rising cost of domestic management systematically dismantles a couple's emotional reserves. Let us trace this breakdown through the daily financial decisions James and Kimberly are forced to make. The single largest line item in their monthly budget is housing. Historically, the South offered a reliable escape hatch from the hyper-expensive housing markets of the Northeast and West Coast. However, the massive influx of corporate investment and remote workers into southern metropolitan zones has caused a severe localized housing supply shock. In James and Kimberly's community, home values and rental rates have surged by 41% over a brief timeline, driven by institutional real estate buyers purchasing affordable suburban tracts. For a couple attempting to maintain a traditional family home, this reality introduces an exhausting dynamic. If they rent, they face arbitrary, steep annual price increases that threaten to displace their children from local school districts. If they attempt to purchase a home in the 2026 market, they are forced to dedicate an unsafe percentage of their net monthly income strictly to servicing a high-interest mortgage. Imagine the immediate friction this creates within a partnership. Every single conversation regarding finance becomes a high-stakes negotiation. A discussion about a broken appliance, a child's dental procedure, or the necessity of new tires ceases to be a practical problem-solving exercise and transforms into a volatile argument about who is spending too much, who is not earning enough, and who is responsible for the impending shortfall. This localized economic pressure is further compounded by the shifting nature of industrial employment across the region. The modern Southern economy has transitioned rapidly toward highly automated manufacturing, just-in-time logistics, and fulfillment services. While these industries bring capital to state GDPs, they impose an incredibly grueling operational cadence on their workforces. Companies maximize their expensive machinery by operating continuous, 24-hour production cycles. For workers like James, this translates into mandatory rotating shifts. One month, James is working the first shift from 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon. The next month, he is abruptly transitioned to the third shift, working from 10 at night until 6 the following morning. The physiological and social consequences of rotating shifts are devastating to a marital partnership. When James is on the night shift, his entire biological clock is completely inverted from the rest of the household. He is sleeping when Kimberly and the children are awake, and he is leaving for work just as they return home. The couple essentially becomes two ships passing in the night, communicating exclusively through text messages or hurried notes left on the kitchen counter. The organic daily rituals that anchor a relationship, sharing a meal, discussing the day's challenges, or providing physical comfort, are completely eliminated from their routine. Case studies compiled by regional family advocates consistently demonstrate that this structural isolation breeds deep-seated resentment. Kimberly, operating as a functional single parent for weeks at a time, experiences profound burnout as she carries the entire weight of child discipline, academic tracking, and domestic maintenance. James, isolated by chronic sleep deprivation and physical exhaustion, feels increasingly alienated from the very family he is destroying his health to support. He becomes a ghost in his own home, valued primarily for his paycheck rather than his presence. When communication does occur in this state of chronic fatigue, it is fast-paced, highly reactive, and devoid of empathy, creating a toxic environment where minor misunderstandings rapidly escalate into irreconcilable emotional divides. Furthermore, we must look at the hidden impact of regional infrastructure gaps on these economic realities. Unlike dense northern urban centers, the American South is fundamentally built around automotive dependency. There is virtually no comprehensive public transportation infrastructure, linking rural and suburban residential zones to industrial employment hubs. For a dual-income household like James and Kimberly's, maintaining two reliable vehicles is not a luxury. It is an absolute baseline requirement for employment. The cost of vehicle acquisition, mandatory insurance premiums, and regional fuel costs represents an inflexible, massive tax on their labor. If one vehicle experiences a catastrophic mechanical failure, the entire domestic operation grinds to an immediate halt. The sudden financial panic of funding a replacement vehicle in the 2026 market can be the ultimate tipping point that pushes a fragile, economically squeezed marriage straight into the hands of a legal counselor. The intersection of these economic macro trends, persistent wage stagnation, a hyperinflated housing market, punishing industrial work schedules, and mandatory infrastructure costs, creates a structural trap for Southern couples. It proves that the high divorce rates in the region cannot be understood merely through the lens of personal morality or cultural choices. The economic soil in which these families are planted is undergoing a severe drought, making it structurally unsustainable for many traditional relationships to survive over the long term. James and Kimberly's struggle illustrates that modern marital instability is often a lagging economic indicator. When a region's economic model demands maximum human output while offering diminishing domestic stability, the family unit acts as the primary shock absorber until it inevitably fractures. But what happens when these economic pressures completely break the relationship, and the household is forced to divide its already scarce resources across two separate residences? How do couples navigate the brutal financial math of child support guidelines, debt allocation, and post-divorce survival when there was barely enough money to support a single household? In the next part of this masterclass, we will dive deep into the hidden mechanics of post-divorce poverty, examining how regional child support enforcement systems and the lack of social safety nets can plunge former spouses into an unforgiving cycle of economic survival. When a single household splits into two separate domestic economic units, the mathematical reality of survival changes immediately, especially across the southern landscape of the United States. To fully understand the mechanics of this post-divorce economic shift, let us look closely at how financial math plays out under the specific statutory guidelines of the region in the year 2026. For a vast majority of families, there is simply no financial surplus available to fund a dual household existence. When the same fixed income that previously struggled to support one mortgage and one grocery bill is suddenly required to stretch across two separate rents, two sets of utility connections, and competing insurance premiums, the result is often a sharp decline into localized economic vulnerability. To trace the precise step-by-step reality of this transition, let us examine a case study involving a family we will call continuous characters, Michael and Jessica, living in a suburban community outside of Jackson, Mississippi. Before their separation, Michael earned a steady salary as an industrial machinery technician, bringing home roughly $48,000 a year, while Jessica worked part-time as a dynamic coordinator for a local school district, contributing an additional $18,000. Together, their combined income of $66,000 allowed them to maintain a modest, traditional family life. However, once the legal decree is finalized in 2026, the state's rigid child support enforcement mechanisms and specific allocation rules take effect, completely restructuring their financial lives. Imagine if you are Michael, sitting in a modest apartment realizing that the state child support guidelines require an immediate mandatory deduction of 24% of your net monthly income for your two children. In Mississippi, child support calculations historically rely on a flat percentage model based on the non-custodial parent's income, rather than the more complex income shares model used in other regions. This means the court looks almost exclusively at Michael's gross earnings, applies a statutory deduction template, and orders an immediate wage garnishment. For Michael, this means roughly $800 is deducted from his paycheck every single month before he ever sees a dime. Step by step, the remaining income must be stretched to cover his own basic survival needs in the 2026 economy. After child support, taxes, and mandatory health insurance premiums for the children are deducted, Michael is left with approximately $2,200 a month. In his local market, a basic, safe two-bedroom apartment, necessary to accommodate his children during court-ordered weekend visitation, costs an average of $1,200 a month. When you add $300 for utilities, $250 for auto insurance and fuel to commute to his industrial job, and $300 for basic groceries, Michael is left with a mere $150 of discretionary income. A single emergency, such as a minor mechanical failure on his truck or a modest increase in regional utility rates, can completely wipe out his financial reserve, pushing him dangerously close to falling behind on his court-ordered obligations. Now, imagine the scenario from Jessica's perspective as the primary custodial parent. While she receives the $800 in monthly child support, she has lost the daily financial pooling that a shared household provides. She is now solely responsible for maintaining the primary residence for the children. The costs of childcare, school clothing, extracurricular fees, and daily nutrition have skyrocketed in 2026. Because southern states historically feature some of the lowest investments in public social safety nets, Jessica faces an uphill battle. In many northern or western states, a single parent facing a sudden drop in income can access robust state-subsidized childcare programs, temporary family nutrition assistance, or localized energy bill relief. In the American South, however, eligibility thresholds for these social safety nets are historically set at exceptionally restrictive levels. In Mississippi, a single mother earning $18,000 a year plus child support often finds herself trapped in a structural gap. She earns too much to qualify for state-subsidized medical coverage or nutrition assistance, but far too little to realistically cover the actual cost of independent domestic management. This structural gap creates an environment of chronic economic instability. If Jessica needs to work extra hours to make up for the financial shortfall, she must secure childcare. However, the cost of quality after-school care in her community can easily consume more than half of her additional earnings. This calculation leads to a state of compounding exhaustion. To survive, many custodial mothers in the region are forced to rely heavily on informal networks, relying on aging grandparents, neighbors, or church members to patch together a volatile, day-to-day childcare routine. If one link in this informal chain breaks, Jessica risks missing a shift at her job, which immediately threatens her employment stability and her ability to pay rent. Furthermore, the legal consequences of falling behind on child support in the South are incredibly swift and punitive, creating a compounding cycle of debt and legal jeopardy for non-custodial parents. If Michael experiences a temporary layoff or an illness that reduces his work hours, the child support obligation does not automatically adjust. He must file a formal petition for modification, a process that requires a dedicated legal counselor, filing fees, and months of waiting for a court date on an overcrowded 2026 docket. During those months, the original child support amount continues to accrue as arrears. Under Southern state statutes, child support arrears are treated with extreme severity. If a parent falls 30 days behind, the state automatically triggers an array of administrative penalties. First, their driver's license is suspended. Imagine the immediate structural contradiction this creates in a region with zero public transit infrastructure. To pay his child support, Michael must get to his industrial job. To get to his job, he must drive. But the state has made driving illegal. If he chooses to drive on a suspended license out of sheer economic necessity and is stopped by local law enforcement, he faces immediate arrest, vehicle impoundment fees, and criminal fines, which further drains his non-existent financial resources. If the arrears continue to accumulate, the state can revoke professional licenses, intercept tax refunds, place liens on property, and ultimately issue a bench warrant for contempt of court, which can lead to incarceration. Historical trends show that these highly punitive measures rarely increase collection rates from low-income or working-class individuals. Instead, they systematically alienate the non-custodial parent from the formal workforce. Faced with a suspended license and impending legal action, some individuals drop out of the traditional corporate economy entirely, turning to under-the-table, uninsured manual labor to avoid automatic wage garnishment, which permanently depresses their career growth and long-term earning potential. The intersection of these rigid child support frameworks, hyper-restrictive social safety nets, and severe administrative penalties transforms the post-divorce journey into an unforgiving cycle of economic survival. The economic reality of a family breakdown in the South is that it frequently forces both individuals into a lower socioeconomic bracket, stripping away the modest financial security they spent decades building together. Michael and Jessica's post-divorce reality demonstrates that the finalization of a divorce is not a clean break, but the beginning of a prolonged, structural struggle against a system designed around rigid compliance rather than economic reality. The financial scars of this process run deep, permanently altering the trajectory of the parents' lives and directly impacting the future opportunities available to their children. But the economic survival struggle is only one dimension of this regional crisis. What happens when these intense financial pressures and structural constraints begin to take a silent, heavy toll on the mental health and emotional well-being of the individuals involved? How do Southern men and women process the immense grief, anxiety, and trauma of a family collapse within a culture that historically stigmatizes mental health struggles and views vulnerability as a profound personal failure? In the next part of this masterclass, we will step into the private, psychological aftermath of the Southern divorce journey, exploring the hidden crisis of isolation, the regional barriers to modern mental health care, and the complex path to emotional recovery in communities that demand stoic resilience above all else. To truly grasp the magnitude of the silent psychological crisis unfolding across the region, we must look beneath the surface of public community life and examine the interior emotional landscape of those navigating a marital collapse. In the American South, the pressure to maintain an outward appearance of domestic perfection and spiritual alignment creates a highly unique psychological environment. When a marriage fractures, the individuals involved do not merely experience standard emotional grief. They are forced to process that grief within a localized culture that historically treats emotional vulnerability as a sign of weakness or a deficit in personal faith. This creates a dangerous intersection of chronic isolation, unaddressed trauma, and systemic barriers to modern mental health care that leaves thousands of individuals suffering in absolute silence in the year 2026. To see how this psychological friction manifests step by step, let us analyze a case study involving our continuous characters, Robert and Amanda, living in a suburban community in western Kentucky. Robert has spent his adult life working within the regional manufacturing sector, a field dominated by traditional cultural definitions of masculinity that emphasize stoic endurance, self-reliance, and physical strength. Amanda has built her identity around her roles in the local school system and community volunteer networks, where her social standing is tied directly to her perceived success as a nurturing mother and a supportive spouse. As their marriage officially dissolves under the weight of the structural and economic pressures we have previously analyzed, both Robert and Amanda find themselves cast adrift in a psychological wilderness, completely unequipped by their environment to handle the emotional fallout. Imagine if you are Robert, returning to an empty apartment after a grueling 12-hour shift at the industrial plant. The physical exhaustion is heavy, but it is completely eclipsed by an overwhelming, suffocating sense of isolation. Throughout your entire life, the cultural messaging you absorbed from family, peers, and regional media was clear. A man handles his problems internally. You do not burden others with your anxieties, you do not openly grieve, and you certainly do not admit that you are struggling to cope with the destruction of your family unit. To do so would invite a profound sense of shame, as traditional networks frequently equate a man's inability to preserve his household with a fundamental failure of character and leadership. Step by step, this internalized pressure forces Robert into a state of severe emotional withdrawal. When his co-workers notice his fatigue or changing demeanor on the factory floor, the interactions remain strictly superficial. In this professional environment, there is no structural vocabulary for discussing mental health. If Robert attempts to seek comfort from his immediate male peer group, the conversations are historically redirected toward distraction, discussing local sports, mechanical projects, or outdoor activities. The deeper issues of anxiety, depression, and identity loss are left completely unaddressed. To numb the compounding psychological pain, individuals in Robert's scenario often turn to destructive coping mechanisms, including increased alcohol consumption, overworking, or reckless behavioral patterns, which further destabilize their mental health and isolate them from the few remaining connections they possess. While Robert battles the silent expectations of masculine stoicism, Amanda faces an equally punishing set of psychological constraints driven by regional gender expectations and community scrutiny. In many traditional Southern networks, a woman's social value is heavily tethered to her ability to project a narrative of domestic harmony and resilient maternal grace. The moment a divorce is publicized, Amanda experiences a profound fragmentation of her self-worth. She feels the heavy, unsaid judgment of her peers every time she drops her children off at school or attends a community function. Imagine the immense mental energy required to maintain a performative veneer of happiness when your internal world is completely shattered. Amanda is constantly navigating a barrage of passive-aggressive commentary, masked as regional politeness. Well-meaning acquaintances offer superficial platitudes or theological rationalizations, telling her that everything happens for a reason or advising her to simply pray harder for strength. This theological framework, while intending to offer comfort, often has the potential outcome of deepening Amanda's psychological distress. It implies that her emotional suffering is a reflection of a weak spiritual foundation, shifting the blame from systemic, multi-layered structural realities directly onto her personal relationship with her faith. The anxiety of being judged as spiritually or socially deficient prevents Amanda from reaching out for authentic support, trapping her in a cycle of performative resilience that masks a deepening clinical depression. This crisis of isolation is severely exacerbated by the profound regional barriers to modern mental health care that characterize the southern United States. If Robert or Amanda actively decide to break through the cultural stigma and seek professional psychological support in 2026, they immediately confront a fragmented and highly inaccessible healthcare infrastructure. Large portions of the rural and suburban South are officially designated by the federal government as health professional shortage areas, particularly in the realm of mental health. In Robert and Amanda's county, there is not a single licensed, secular psychologist or clinical psychiatrist operating an independent practice. To secure an appointment with a modern, evidence-based trauma therapist, An individual must travel more than 60 miles to the nearest major metropolitan center. Working-class individual like Robert, whose industrial schedule demands strict hourly compliance, or for a single mother like Amanda, who is balancing solo childcare and work, the simple logistics of this commute represent an insurmountable barrier. Furthermore, the financial cost is prohibitive. Many regional employer-sponsored health insurance plans offer hyper-restrictive coverage for mental health services, requiring high deductibles or out-of-pocket co-payments that are completely unrealistic for a household navigating the economic devastation of a recent split. Faced with these structural barriers, the vast majority of individuals seeking guidance default to the only accessible infrastructure available: pastoral counseling. While some modern Southern congregations have integrated licensed mental health professionals into their staff, the historical trend in smaller, traditional churches is to rely exclusively on biblical counseling frameworks. These frameworks often treat complex psychological conditions such as generalized anxiety disorder, clinical depression, and post-traumatic stress entirely through a spiritual lens. An individual suffering from severe clinical anxiety due to a high-conflict divorce may be told that their panic attacks are a result of a lack of trust in divine providence, and they are prescribed scriptural reading and increased church attendance as the primary therapeutic intervention. While this can offer temporary community comfort, it completely fails to address the underlying neurological and psychological mechanisms of trauma, leaving individuals structurally unprotected as their mental health continues to deteriorate. The long-term potential outcomes of this unaddressed psychological trauma are devastating for the entire regional fabric. When parents are forced to navigate a systemic family breakdown without adequate mental health infrastructure or emotional support, the chronic stress bleeds directly into their parenting capacity. Children growing up in these environments absorb the unexpressed grief, the silent tension, and the volatile coping mechanisms of their caregivers, embedding a cycle of relational trauma that can persist for generations. Robert and Amanda's internal struggle demonstrates that the cultural divorce journey in the American South is, at its core, a profound crisis of human wellness. The system demands that individuals enter high-risk marital structures early, penalizes them financially and socially when those structures fail, and then denies them the psychological tools and infrastructure necessary to heal from the wreckage. As Robert sits alone in his apartment and Amanda navigates the silent judgments of her social circle, they represent a vast, invisible demographic of modern Southern individuals fighting an exhausting war for emotional survival. They are trapped between a culture that demands stoic perfection and a reality that delivers structural fragmentation. But as the year 2026 progresses, a quiet, fast-paced shift is beginning to emerge from within the region itself. A new generation of Southern individuals, organizers, and professionals is starting to challenge these long-standing psychological and social paradigms. How are modern communities beginning to rewrite the script on mental health, masculinity, and family structures in the Bible Belt? What are the emerging trends and grassroots movements that seek to dismantle the stigma of divorce and build a more empathetic, structurally supportive future for the Southern family? In the next part of this masterclass, we will explore the horizon of cultural reformation, analyzing the rise of secular support networks, the evolution of modern co-parenting models, and the changing attitudes of the Southern youth who are redefining love and commitment from the ground up. To accurately evaluate this emerging horizon of cultural reformation, we must analyze the specific generational mechanics altering the social landscape of the American South in the year 2026. A profound demographic shift is currently underway. The youngest cohort of adults entering the marriage market, alongside millennials who have observed or survived the structural collapses of the previous decades, are actively rewriting the rules of engagement. They are no longer passively accepting the accelerated life cycle timelines or the rigid institutional containment mechanisms that define the marital journeys of their parents. Instead, a fast-paced cultural reorganization is manifesting across Southern suburbs and urban centers, built on a foundation of deliberate choice, secular community building, and modernized approaches to domestic partnership. To observe this generational pivot step by step, let us examine a case study involving a couple we will call continuous characters, Taylor and Jordan, living in a rapidly diversifying tech and manufacturing corridor in North Carolina. Both Taylor and Jordan were raised in deeply traditional, church-centric households in rural parts of the state, where early marriage windows were aggressively encouraged. However, as they navigate their mid-20s in 2026, their approach to relationship stabilization deviates completely from the historical regional blueprint. They have chosen to delay marriage indefinitely, opting instead for a multi-year period of cohabitation while they establish financial independence, complete higher education, and secure stable career footing in a highly competitive regional economy. Imagine if you are Taylor, facing the intense resistance of your extended family during a holiday gathering, because you and your partner have lived together for 3 years without a legal or religious marriage certificate. In the traditional Southern paradigm, this choice is still viewed by older generations as a severe moral compromise and a rejection of community values. Yet, for Taylor and Jordan, this deliberate deceleration is a pragmatic shield against the very macroeconomic and psychological vulnerabilities that dismantled the marriages of their older siblings. By extending their premarital timeline, they are allowing their individual identities, financial behaviors, and career trajectories to fully solidify before entering into a binding legal contract. Historical trends across the United States suggest that delaying marriage until individual executive functioning is fully developed significantly improves long-term relationship stability, and this younger Southern generation is applying that data directly to their lives, regardless of the localized social friction it creates. This generational deceleration has triggered a secondary structural evolution: rapid rise of secular support networks across the region. For generations, the church congregation was the only viable space for community integration, emotional processing, and family mutual aid in the South. If an individual stepped outside that framework due to a divorce, they faced immediate social isolation. In 2026, however, a parallel infrastructure is emerging to fill this civic vacuum. Divorced individuals, single parents, and young adults are utilizing modern digital platforms, localized secular nonprofits, and community interest groups to construct robust support networks completely independent of theological institutions. Let us trace how these secular networks function step by step to mitigate the post-divorce isolation we analyzed previously. Consider a divorced single mother navigating her routine in a mid-sized city like Greenville, South Carolina. Instead of relying on a church-sponsored single-parent ministry that might require adherence to strict moral codes or invite passive judgment, she plugs directly into a regional, grassroots co-op network. This secular network operates via decentralized applications, providing peer-to-peer child care swapping, shared domestic labor pools, and mutual aid funds for unexpected economic shocks. Furthermore, these spaces foster an environment of authentic emotional processing. In these modern peer groups, there is no structural requirement to project a veneer of performative resilience or spiritual perfection. Individuals can openly discuss the complex trauma of family dissolution, the realities of economic survival, and the anxieties of co-parenting without fear of social exile or character assassination. This shifting dynamic is fundamentally changing the potential outcomes for divorced individuals, providing them with a safe, empathetic landing zone that allows for genuine psychological recovery and rapid community reintegration. Simultaneously, the mechanics of post-divorce family management are undergoing an equally profound modernization through the widespread adoption of collaborative co-parenting models. Historically, as we explored in the family court analysis, the Southern divorce journey often resulted in a highly adversarial winner-take-all custody arrangement, casting one parent as the primary caregiver and the other as a distant economic provider. In 2026, a growing contingent of separated Southern parents is actively rejecting this binary model, working consciously to decouple their failed romantic relationship from their ongoing parental partnership. Imagine an environment where co-parents utilize advanced asynchronous communication applications to manage every aspect of their children's lives, entirely eliminating the volatile face-to-face drop-offs that historically triggered domestic conflict. In this modernized framework, medical records, academic calendars, and financial receipts for extracurricular expenses are logged with mathematical precision within a shared digital ledger. Step by step, this reliance on structured, transparent technology de-escalates the emotional friction between former spouses. Moreover, this structural shift is influencing the physical architecture of Southern domestic life. A growing number of modern co-parents are intentionally remaining in close geographic proximity, sometimes renting or purchasing homes within the exact same school district or neighborhood, to minimize the disruption to their children's daily routines. This model allows children to transition between maternal and paternal households seamlessly, maintaining consistent access to both parents, their peer groups, and local activities. It represents a profound shift from the rigid, court-ordered travel schedules of the past, proving that even within a culture that deeply values the traditional nuclear household, families can successfully innovate new structures to preserve stability for the next generation. This dual transformation, the deceleration of early relationship milestones among youth, and the rise of secular, collaborative support systems for those restructuring their families, is systematically shifting the cultural tectonic plates of the American South. The long-standing stigma surrounding divorce is slowly being dismantled, replaced by a nuanced, data-driven understanding of family health. Younger Southern adults are recognizing that a high-conflict, economically unsustainable marriage is far more damaging to individual wellness and child development than a deliberate, legally clean separation followed by collaborative co-parenting. Taylor and Jordan's calculated approach, alongside the millions of modern co-parents and community organizers reshaping the region, points toward a future where the Southern family is defined not by rigid adherence to an archaic blueprint, but by its capacity for resilience, structural adaptation, and emotional authenticity. They are proving that it is entirely possible to love the South, respect its rich history, and deeply cherish its community traditions while simultaneously demanding a modern, healthier framework for human relationships. But this generational shift does not happen in a vacuum, and the older traditional infrastructure is not giving way without a fight. As these modern paradigms gain velocity across progressive Southern cities and economic hubs, they are running headfirst into deep institutional resistance from conservative state legislatures, traditional religious organizations, and entrenched legal frameworks that are actively working to preserve the old order. How are these competing cultural forces colliding as we look toward the future? What happens when modern generational values attempt to operate within legal and political systems designed explicitly to enforce the traditional family structure at all costs? In the next part of this masterclass, we will dive deep into the macro-level cultural war over the Southern household, analyzing the legislative pushback against modern relationship models, the evolution of covenant marriage statutes, and the future of family policy in a deeply divided region. The institutional resistance to these shifting generational values is not merely passive social friction. It is a highly coordinated, macro-level campaign playing out across state legislatures, legal systems, and policy boards throughout the region in the year 2026. To fully comprehend this ideological tug-of-war, we must analyze the explicit mechanisms being deployed to preserve the traditional family unit by force of law. For decades, conservative policymakers and traditional religious coalitions have viewed rising divorce rates and the delay of marriage milestones as a direct threat to the social stability and moral fabric of the region. In response, they have developed and refined a series of legislative and policy interventions specifically designed to increase the friction required to exit a marriage, disincentivize alternative relationship models, and re-establish the historic nuclear blueprint as the absolute baseline for civic life. To witness how this structural pushback manifests step by step, let us examine a case study involving a couple we will call continuous characters, William and Heather, residing in Louisiana. When they married 6 years ago, they opted into a unique legal framework known as a covenant marriage. Louisiana was the pioneer of this statutory model, followed closely by Arizona and Arkansas. A covenant marriage is a legally distinct contract that fundamentally alters the potential outcomes of a relationship by stripping away the option of a standard, unilateral no-fault divorce. When a couple signs a covenant marriage license, they are legally binding themselves to a set of rules that require premarital counseling, mandatory marital counseling if friction arises, and exceptionally strict fault-based grounds for dissolution, such as adultery, a felony conviction, or abandonment. Imagine if you are Heather, navigating a deeply unhappy partnership in 2026, realizing that because you signed a covenant marriage contract, you cannot simply file for divorce based on irreconcilable differences. Step by step, the legal system forces you through an incredibly complex, high-friction gauntlet. To even initiate the separation process, you must first prove to a court that you have exhausted every single mandated counseling option with a state-approved provider. If the counseling fails, you cannot simply move out and finalize a dissolution in a few months. Under covenant marriage statutes, if there is no proof of explicit fault like physical abuse or a felony, the couple must undergo a mandatory, continuous physical separation period of a full 2 years before a judge has the legal authority to sign a divorce decree. This 2-year mandatory separation timeline represents a massive, intentional barrier. Imagine the immense structural and economic strain this puts on an individual. For 2 years, William and Heather are trapped in a legal limbo. They must maintain 2 separate households, fund duplicate utility bills, and handle separate grocery costs, all while their joint assets, retirement accounts, and property values remain completely frozen by the court. Historical trends show that this deliberate legal friction is designed to exhaust the partners emotionally and financially, effectively forcing them back into a state of cohabitation out of sheer economic survival. It is a powerful example of how state policy can be weaponized to enforce domestic endurance, overriding individual choices in favor of institutional preservation. While covenant marriage statutes represent the most explicit form of legal containment, a much broader legislative pushback is targeting standard no-fault divorce laws across multiple Southern capitals in 2026. In state houses from Texas to Florida, conservative legislative coalitions are actively introducing bills aimed at eliminating or severely restricting unilateral no-fault divorce entirely. The argument put forward by proponents of these bills is that the ease of modern dissolution has created a culture of disposability that harms children and destabilizes local economies. They seek to return to a system where, if one spouse resists the divorce, the seeking spouse must meet an incredibly high burden of proof regarding marital misconduct. Let us analyze the step-by-step potential outcomes if these legislative rollbacks achieve full momentum. If unilateral no-fault divorce is restricted, a spouse facing an emotionally toxic or financially destructive environment would be forced to hire private investigators, compile forensic audio and video surveillance, and subpoena witnesses simply to prove fault in a public courtroom. This immediately drives up the pacing and cost of legal fees, transforming a private family matter into an expensive, highly adversarial public trial. Furthermore, case studies from legal defense funds indicate that restricting no-fault provisions disproportionately traps vulnerable individuals in dangerous domestic situations, as the financial barrier to proving fault becomes completely out of reach for a lower-income or dependent spouse. Beyond the courtroom, this macro-level cultural war extends directly into the realm of regional family policy and tax structures. In 2026, Southern state governments are increasingly using fiscal levers to favor the traditional nuclear household over alternative arrangements. For instance, several states have restructured their localized tax codes and social assistance distribution templates to introduce what critics call a single-parent penalty. Under these modernized guidelines, state tax credits, childcare subsidies, and family wellness grants are structured with eligibility thresholds that explicitly favor married couples filing jointly, while single parents or unmarried cohabiting couples face lower phase-out limits and reduced benefit allocations. Imagine if you are a single parent trying to access state-subsidized pre-kindergarten programs or regional health initiatives, only to discover that the statutory criteria have been tightened to prioritize households with a married father and mother present. This policy design is not accidental. It is a calculated attempt to use state resources to incentivize marriage and penalize deviation from the traditional norm. It places alternative family structures, blended households, and divorced parents at a continuous structural disadvantage, forcing them to operate with fewer resources in an already punishing economic environment. This legislative and policy pushback has transformed the American South into a deeply divided battleground, where the fast-paced evolution of modern relationship dynamics is on a direct collision course with the rigid machinery of state law. On one side stands a generation demanding autonomy, flexibility, and evidence-based mental health support. On the other stands an entrenched institutional matrix determined to enforce stability through legal friction, fiscal coercion, and traditional values. The family unit has become the ultimate proxy war for the broader cultural identity of the region. William and Heather's struggle within the covenant marriage framework, alongside the broader legislative battles over no-fault statutes and single-parent policies, illustrates that the cultural divorce journey in the South is inextricably bound to the political landscape. The choices an individual makes about their private domestic life are continuously monitored, restricted, and shaped by a state apparatus that views the traditional household as an uncompromisable foundation of public order. As these competing forces lock horns in 2026, the question of how the Southern family will survive this systemic gridlock becomes paramount. Will the legislative barriers successfully contain the modern push for relationship autonomy, forcing a return to historic models of marital endurance? Or will the sheer velocity of generational change and economic pressure inevitably shatter these legal constraints, forcing a complete revolution in how the region defines family, law, and community? In the 10th and final part of this masterclass, we will synthesize every dimension of our deep dive investigation, projecting the ultimate trajectory of the Southern household over the next decade, and providing the definitive analysis of what it truly takes to navigate love, law, and survival in the modern American South. To synthesize the ultimate trajectory of this regional crisis, as we look past the year 2026, we must bring all these competing structural, economic, and institutional forces into a singular analytical focal point. The cultural divorce journey in the American South is not a story of individual moral decisions or simple relationship failures. It is the visible byproduct of a massive macro-level tectonic shift. For over a century, the regional identity of the South was anchored by a highly synchronized blueprint: early marriage, traditional gender roles, religious containment, and multi-generational community integration. But as we have documented step by step throughout this deep dive masterclass, the economic reality, the legal evolution, and the generational values of the modern world have completely decoupled from that historic framework. The result is a profound structural mismatch where the old expectations remain deeply entrenched, but the foundations required to support them have completely eroded. To map the final potential outcomes of this cultural gridlock over the next decade, let us look closely at a comprehensive case study that brings our continuous analysis full circle. Consider the baseline trajectory of a newly formed household in 2026, represented by a young Southern couple we will call continuous characters, Marcus and Savannah, living in a suburban expansion zone outside of Houston, Texas. Marcus works as a specialized technical operator in the regional petrochemical infrastructure, while Savannah is building a career as an independent digital operations analyst. They are highly educated, deeply attached to their regional heritage, and explicitly desire to build a stable, long-term traditional family. Yet, from the exact moment they initiate their partnership, they are forced to navigate the full velocity of the systemic regional forces we have uncovered. Imagine if you are Marcus and Savannah, attempting to build a stable domestic life while trapped between two completely incompatible worldviews. On one side, your extended family networks and local civic institutions continuously pressure you to accelerate your milestones, to purchase the large suburban home, to have children early, and to conform to the traditional model of the husband as the primary corporate provider and the wife as the primary domestic manager. On the other side, the cold math of the 2026 macroeconomy dictates that a single-income household is no longer viable for maintaining a middle-class standard of living in their area. Property taxes, healthcare premiums, and modern child development costs require both Marcus and Savannah to maintain high output, demanding career paths that leave very little time or energy for traditional domestic upkeep. Step by step, this tension creates a high-velocity environment for potential relationship erosion. If Marcus and Savannah conform to the traditional expectations and pull Savannah out of the full-time workforce to raise children early, they immediately expose their household to extreme economic vulnerability. A single industrial layoff, a localized manufacturing downturn, or an unexpected medical event can instantly plunge them into the cycle of debt and financial strain that we previously analyzed as a primary driver of regional divorce rates. Conversely, if they choose to reject the traditional model and maintain dual, intense career trajectories, they run headfirst into the severe lack of institutional social safety nets and public childcare infrastructure that characterizes the region. They are forced to dedicate a massive percentage of their labor to funding private, high-cost domestic management, creating a state of chronic physical and emotional exhaustion that slowly dismantles their partnership from within. Historical trends suggest that over the next decade, this structural pressure will lead to a profound balkanization of the Southern family structure, dividing the region into two distinct sociological trajectories. The first trajectory will be characterized by a rapid acceleration of the secular, decentralized relationship models pioneered by the younger generation. In progressive Southern urban hubs like Austin, Atlanta, Charlotte, and Nashville, the traditional marriage blueprint will continue to lose its systemic monopoly. More and more young adults will choose to delay marriage into their 30s, opt for long-term cohabitation contracts, or bypass the legal institution of marriage entirely to insulate their personal assets and emotional lives from the rigid, high-friction family court codes of their home states. These urban communities will see a compounding growth of the secular support networks, collaborative co-parenting co-ops, and accessible mental health initiatives that we explored in the previous sections. In these environments, the social stigma of divorce will systematically evaporate, replaced by a cultural framework that prioritizes individual wellness, economic autonomy, and pragmatic family stability over institutional endurance at all costs. The potential outcomes for individuals within this trajectory include higher baseline career stability, lower rates of catastrophic legal bankruptcies, and healthier developmental environments for children, who will grow up free from the toxic friction of unsustainable, contained marriages. However, the second trajectory will manifest across the rural, deeply conservative heartland of the Bible Belt, where entrenched institutional resistance will create an entirely different set of potential outcomes. In these communities, state legislatures and traditional religious coalitions will continue to aggressively scale up the legal friction and fiscal penalties we analyzed in our policy review. They will work to eliminate unilateral no-fault divorce, expand covenant marriage initiatives, and restrict access to public resources for alternative family structures. Imagine the reality in these rural zones by the mid-2030s. Because the underlying economic drivers, such as wage stagnation, industrial automation, and automotive dependency, will remain completely unaddressed by these defensive family policies, the structural strain on rural households will reach unprecedented levels. Couples will be legally and economically coerced into remaining in highly dysfunctional, emotionally fractured marriages for years or decades out of sheer terror of the punitive legal and financial consequences of a split. This will create a hidden epidemic of domestic distress, where the outward appearance of high marital stability and traditional alignment masks a deep, systemic crisis of mental health, unaddressed trauma, and localized poverty. The family unit in these zones will cease to function as a source of emotional restoration and instead operate as a state-enforced economic containment vessel. This definitive analysis reveals that there is no singular future for the Southern household. Instead, there is a deepening geographic and cultural divide that matches the broader polarization of the United States. To successfully navigate love, law, and survival in the modern American South, individuals must move past superficial romantic narratives and develop a sophisticated, structural literacy regarding the environment they inhabit. They must recognize that the regional blueprint they inherited was designed for an entirely different economic and social epoch. Attempting to execute that blueprint in the year 2026 without actively accounting for the hidden legal mechanics, the macroeconomic squeezes, and the psychological costs is a high-risk endeavor that can lead to catastrophic personal fallout. As Marcus and Savannah look toward their future, their success will depend entirely on their capacity to build a partnership based on structural realism, explicit communication, and flexible adaptation. They must learn to insulate their relationship from both the hyper-accelerated expectations of their community and the rigid, punitive machinery of their state legal codes. They represent the ultimate choice facing millions of modern Southern couples, whether to break under the weight of an archaic framework or to become the architects of a new, healthier, and more authentic definition of family. The cultural divorce journey in the American South is a powerful reminder that human relationships do not exist in a vacuum. They are continuously shaped, challenged, and redefined by the invisible architecture of our societies. But as the old structures continue to fracture under the pressure of modern reality, the space is officially clearing for a profound human transformation. The story of the Southern family is far from over. It is simply undergoing its most volatile, necessary evolution yet. If you want to understand how these exact same economic disruptions and legislative battles are silently transforming family dynamics, property rights, and domestic life in other rapidly changing regions across the United States, click on our next investigation as we cross the geographic border to look at the hidden collapse of the traditional family contract in the American Midwest.